so much, I remember being completely brought to tears by the end of it, and I couldn't talk to anybody. I had to walk around in the parking lot for about 10, 15 minutes before I could just bring myself together. Because I'd never seen anyone give himself totally to being a disciple of Christ. And then later, during my college years, I was part of the Canterbury Club, the Episcopal students, and we would always join together with the Roman Catholic Student Association and celebrate the Feast of St. Francis in October with Blessing of the Animals. And one year in particular, I remember the Roman Catholic students had two of their Franciscan friars with them, and it just so happened that two Episcopal Franciscan brothers joined us as well. They had left their mother house, the one I later visited, Little Portion Friary, up in Long Island, and had traveled down the eastern seaboard on foot, hitchhiking, just the two of them. All they had was their sleeping bags and a Book of Common Prayer and a Bible. And they had decided to do this in response to the gospel story of Jesus sending out the 72, 2 by 2, and telling them to carry no purse or haversack and not take 2 tunics, and to preach the good news and rely on the kindness of strangers. So they would go to Episcopal churches along the way and offer to do a preachment or quiet day, and in exchange for a warm meal and the ability to sleep on the parish hall floor. So I remember 2 things in particular standing out for me by meeting them. One was, growing up in Virginia, we had churchmanship that we called frog belly low. We were very low church. And so I had no idea that the Episcopal Church had religious orders. This was news to me. So that was one thing that struck me. But the second thing, which was more important, was once again, I found myself being confronted by people living out a response to the gospel stories in ways that I had never seen done before. I was just astounded that these 2 guys would just walk with nothing and trust that God would take care of them. So obviously that wrestling with that continued for my senior year, and when I finished, I decided that I had to go test my vocation with them in the religious life. Now, you know, when we speak about religious life, that is a particular phrase meaning life living in a religious community, an order of brothers or sisters. It just doesn't mean that you're a religious person. The religious life. And I bring this story up because the gospel that we just heard read has for centuries been seen sort of as the springboard of that religious life, as one of the ways of answering that call to discipleship we heard. And it's a hard call. And in fact, this gospel reading freaks a lot of people out. Usually the first comment I get is, "Whoa, what are you talking about? I thought Jesus said we're supposed to love everybody. What is this about him telling us to hate our parents and our children and our brothers and sisters and friends and everything?" Well, you have to understand the forms of hyperbole, exaggeration that were quite part of Semitic experience and Aramaic language that Jesus spoke. You overstate things to make a point. So Jesus was not saying that we should have animosity or ill will towards our relatives and friends, but rather he was saying that if we want to be his disciple, that we must put nothing ahead of that relationship. And if we put someone else ahead of it, then we're their disciple. But to be Jesus' disciple, he must have primacy in that relationship. And you know, when we think about this, well, why do you say it? Why do you say hate? Well, we do a similar thing in the marriage rite. We use that hyperbole in the marriage rite. You remember when the couple is getting ready for the vows, and the priest says, "Will you be faithful to one another, forsaking all others, as long as you both shall live?" Forsaking, that's a harsh word. When we forsake something, we turn our back on it, we have nothing to do with it. That's not what the vow is about. It's not about not having any friends, not having close friendships, not doing nice things for people. No, it's saying in our earthly relationships, will this relationship be primary? Will it hold your ultimate allegiance above all others? So that's the kind of thing that Jesus is talking about in that gospel. And those who've gone into the religious life have chosen this one way to answer that call. Forsaking family and friends, leaving them to go live in community, forsaking the opportunity to have their own family and friends. They live under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So it means they don't get married, they don't have their own possessions, they forsake having a lucrative career, all those things. And I realize that there are probably very, very few people sitting here today that are going to at some point respond to a call like that. And I was telling them at 8 o'clock it was even more true. I said that the pool gets limited when you consider that most religious orders today don't accept anybody over their 40s. So there may be some younger people here that might at some point in their lives think, I want to make that commitment. But that doesn't mean that we just ignore the witness and the richness that the religious orders bring to the life of the church. I think our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters are much better at this than we are. They understand the richness that the orders bring. And there's a great celebration of the whole church. I mean, look at this weekend in Rome, the canonization of Mother Teresa, but also that's a celebration of the work and witness of the Sisters of Charity on behalf of the whole church. And there are ways that we can even become more involved in that without living under the vows. Some of you will remember a few years ago, Sister Eleanor Francis, who's the superior of the community of St. John Baptist in Mendham, New Jersey, came out. These were the sisters who ran the school for 40-some years in the first part of the 20th century, and for whom our church is named. I mean, we're named St. John the Baptist, but it's because they were the community of St. John Baptist. And when she was here, you might remember that I was received as an associate of their order. I'm not living under those vows, and I'm not with them, but what that means is that we support each other in a life of prayer. I know that those sisters are regularly praying for me, and I pray for them every day in my prayers, and pray for each of them by name. And there are opportunities for me to make maybe a retreat at their house sometime if I get back there. Of course, I'm sure they love any financial offerings that I give for their work and mission. But there's this relationship that truly keeps us from being parochial, literally parochial. We tend to get involved in our parishes, which is wonderful. That's where we live out our faith. But we forget this wider family of Christian witness and to be connected with someone so far away. She was pleasantly surprised when she came here and heard about the work of St. Benedict's Guild. St. Benedict's Guild is it's for our whole diocese, but it's basically situated here in Portland. And it's a group of people who are anyone that has a relationship as an associate of a religious order, because there are not that many of us in one particular one. So they all come together. They do a retreat once a year, I think over at the Franciscan Sisters in Beaverton for a weekend, and then they have a quiet day in Lent and Advent. And in fact, St. John's often hosts that quiet day. It's open to everyone, but it's to foster that religious life of prayer, because each of the orders are involved in works of mercy. We usually say they're apostolates. Some are teaching orders, some are involved in hospitals, some with the poor. But what they all have in common is they are steeped in a deep life of prayer. In fact, when I was with the Franciscans, I was only with them a year, but that transformed my prayer life ever since. We prayed 4 times a day. We gathered in our chapel. And some orders have their own books of worship. We used the Book of Common Prayer. And we prayed daily morning prayer, noonday prayer, evening prayer, and compline every day together in community. That's a hard schedule to keep when you're out in the workaday world. But ever since that time, I have continued to have morning and evening prayer from the prayer book as a part of my daily practice. And so this life of prayer brings us all together. And it's a great witness to the entire church. And so I hope today that we'll hold up the religious orders in our church, in our prayers, and maybe some of you might consider being an associate of a religious order. As I said, I'm with the Community of St. John the Baptist. I know Fred you're with the community of the Order of St. Julian of Norwich, a great mystic, English mystic. Anybody else here who is an associate of religious order? I know the Spears who used to be here were Franciscans. Kimberly, who are you with? St. John the Evangelist. You know, our former rector, Father Greenfield, left here to become a brother. And they're also known as the Cowley Fathers. Right, so these special relationships, sort of like being in a religious fraternity and sorority. And you don't have to be, they are a men's order, but you're an associate as a woman, and I'm an associate of a woman's order. So there's no boundary that way. So I commend that to you, but most importantly, I hope these scriptures will reach out to us where we are in our answering a call to discipleship. Because this is one way that some people have responded to the choice of following Christ. And that's what all these lessons are about today. Jesus, he even got more problematic at the end of, you heard that last thing of the gospel was, you cannot be my disciple unless you give up all your possessions. Did he mean that literally? Well, for some people, yes. That's what Francis did. That's what people who go into the religious life do. They give up their possessions. But what is at the heart is that Semitic hyperbole, is that we are constantly, he's asking us to choose him and to let go of what gets in the way. So we need to look at our own lives and say, what do we need to let go of? And if we're honest with you, we know what those are, whether they're addictive behaviors or destructive relationships, or perhaps a job that's eating away at our soul because we don't believe in its principles. They're things that we are called to let go of and to choose Christ. And that wonderful epistle reading, we don't hear it that much, and very few people preach on it, but that letter to Philemon. Slavery was a part of the ancient world. It was just a given. And Philemon had this slave Onesimus, and Paul writes him asking him to choose of his own free will to free this slave. Of course, I laugh. We were talking about beforehand that, it's his own free will, but Paul doesn't hesitate to use a lot of guilt. Not to mention that you owe me your very self. But would you do this freely, just for me? But Paul points out the irony that by Philemon actually letting go of what was considered valuable human property, to let go, he receives so much more in return. Because he receives Onesimus back not as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. And so often, as hard as it is to let go of our possessions, which may not only be things, but they may be attitudes or parts of our personality, as hard as it is to let go, we can be so much more deeply blessed by what we receive in that. And then that reading from Deuteronomy, I think one of the great readings from the Hebrew Scriptures, is the crux of what we're talking about in discipleship. God holds before us life and death and says, choose life. Choose life. That's what this call is about. Some people that enter religious life answer it one way. Maddie is going to talk to us about a way that she is answering it in terms of what she's letting go and what she is choosing. And every day that we wake up, we're presented with all these choices of life. Some big, some minuscule. But may we always hold Christ at the center and always, always joyfully choose life. Amen.
Amen.